Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks here on my YouTube channel. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be continuing on with the project building a oak frame, wooden frame, using a piece of live edge oak that I milled myself in Los Olivos. And if you didn't see the first episode in this series, make sure to check it out. I'll link it above. And yeah, let's keep going. After cutting the 45-degree angles on each end of the four pieces, I unfortunately realized that one of the side pieces was just a little bit too short, and so I needed to find a solution to make the four pieces fit nice and snug together without having to cut them all a little bit shorter, because I couldn't do that. The size of the frame needed to match the tile mosaic exactly, and so I had to find a way to fix my mistake. So what I did is I went over to my miter saw and I took one of the offcut pieces from when I was cutting down the slab in the first part of this series. Since the offcut piece was from a piece that's actually making up the four parts of the frame, the grain pattern matches up super well, and I'll be able to blend this later on. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait, what? Well, just hold on for a second, keep watching, and you'll see what I mean. See what I mean? Simple, but pretty effective, especially when it comes to making frames, which are hard to get perfect. So once I was finished with confronting my shame, I went ahead and moved on to the next step. I wanted to hide the edge of the tile mosaic so that it looked a little bit more seamless between the frame and the tile mosaic, so I decided to cut a rabbet on the inside of each of the pieces so that there was a bit of a recess for the edge of the tile to sit. Now, once again, you might be thinking to yourself, what? What do you mean? I don't understand. And that's perfectly fine. If you keep watching, I'll explain it here in a bit. As you can see, I just pulled out my DeWalt palm router with a plunge base, and I'm getting it ready to make a cut by attaching the vacuum and lining it all up with this edge guide that attaches to the plunge base. Pretty nifty. I'll put links in the description below. I made sure to clamp the piece on my work surface, or to my work surface, and give myself enough space on the workpiece for the router guide / plunge base. This attachment to the DeWalt plunge base has a fence that you can adjust, and so what I did is put in a 1/4 inch bit. It's just a square, simple bit, and I set it up so that it would make a cut right on the very edge of the piece of oak, and I'll do a few cuts so that I can get a nice rabbet or inset / groove / I don't know exactly what you want to call this, but it will be on the inside face of the frame, and it will hold the outside corner of the tile mosaic so that the edge is kind of hidden, and it'll look really nice. I used my chisel to scrape away any of the wood that was left over after I did the cutting with my router. I think in the end this recess or cut was about 3/8 of an inch, or maybe 7/16, something like that. Here is a bit of a better perspective of what I'm doing, and I made sure to do a pass with the plunge not going too deep the first time, and then I increased it after doing one cut so that I wasn't trying to take off too much at once. If you try to take off too much at once, you'll overload your router, even if it's a big router, and or you'll end up getting chips in your workpiece, which isn't fun. It's also a good idea to have a vacuum attached to the attachment for the plunge base to essentially suck up some of that dust, because you can see that it creates a lot of dust, a lot of wood shavings. After that, I moved the clamp so that I could finish cutting the last section of this first piece for the 4-part frame. Before moving on to the next piece of the frame to do the exact same thing, I wanted to first test and make sure that the groove that I had just cut fits up against the tile mosaic. And I ended up doing an adjustment to this later on for one of the pieces just to make it fit a little bit better. But overall, right now, as I'm looking, it fit pretty well, and I think it'll be a nice touch to the frame. After that, it was time to move on to the second piece that I would be cutting out that groove on the backside to hide the corner of the mosaic. After doing one piece, the second piece was a whole lot easier and more straightforward. Once I had dialed in the router with the correct adjustment with the little fence that I attached to the plunge base, it was pretty smooth sailing from there. I just did lots of cuts, lots of passes to make the cutting pretty straightforward, and I'd highly recommend getting this attachment as well as a plunge base for your palm router. You really can do almost just about anything with a router, but it can be a little dangerous. And that's coming from somebody who's experienced some danger around a router, so be safe. The kind of ridiculous thing is I have a router table that's got an old router in it. It's an old Craftsman that I bought from somebody, I think from one of my friend's dads. Yeah, pretty sure. Anyways, I have that, and I don't really use it very often because it's kind of a pain to set up, and it doesn't really work as easy as this attachment for the plunge base on my DeWalt palm router. The DeWalt palm router just works really well. What can I say? It works really good. But in all seriousness, I think I'm gonna sell that router table. It's taking up space, and yeah, I don't use it. But you didn't click on this video to listen to me talk about routers. You clicked on it to learn a little bit on how to make a frame. And this technique that I'm using right here could be used on smaller frames, and it'd actually be a lot easier with smaller frames. You don't have to do as much cutting. And it would be a great method to hide the edge of a piece of artwork, say a canvas or something like that. I guess you could make the argument that it would be easier to do it on or using a router table as opposed to this method, because you wouldn't actually have to clamp down the workpiece. You'd actually just be holding the workpiece. But I digress. Who knows? What's the better method? But that is the reality of woodworking, is there are so many different ways to do one thing. That can definitely make it difficult to figure out the best method for your situation, especially given what tools you have. You know, depending on the tools that you have, how can you do it with the tools that you have? That's a good question to ask. And there are ways that are more efficient than other ways, especially given the tools that you have versus the tools that you don't have, and which tools you could potentially get. Not to say that you should go and buy a bunch of new tools, but think about the time it takes you to do each process given the tool that you have. So at this point, I had finished cutting the rabbets on all 4 of the frame pieces, and I wanted to do a bit of a test fit, but since the height of the tile was just a bit a bit off of my workbench. I used a couple pieces of scrap wood to line everything up to test it out. I quickly noticed that I needed to make the rabbet for the top piece a little bit wider. So I flipped the piece over, clamped down the piece of wood, and then went back to doing a bit more cutting with my router. So to re-explain what's going on, I am using my DeWalt palm router and a plunge base that allows me to be able to attach a guide that has a dust collection port so I can attach my vacuum. And I am going to be moving it just over to the left, or I guess that's to the right, but to make the rabbet just a little bit wider. This will ultimately make the frame sit better around the tile mosaic that I'm making this frame for, and that's essentially the service that I offer, is custom work that is unique and specific to whatever the need is. That's the problem that I'm solving. But as you can see, cutting this rabbet is pretty simple using the guide that attaches to the plunge router base for the DeWalt palm router. I'll put links below. So after making the rabbet just a bit wider, I went back over to the frame that I had set up around the tile mosaic, and I tested out that piece, and everything seemed to fit really well. Or at least I thought at that point. Ignorance is bliss. So like any woodworker who has experienced the pain of making a mistake, I decided to check it one other way so that I could ensure that the pieces were all cut appropriately before gluing everything together. I first flipped over all of the pieces so that I could line them up with the rabbet facing up. And then I pulled out the strap clamps that I love using for frames, and I pulled the strap all the way around the giant frame, and I did this so that I could squeeze them all together and test out the fit. Now, I knew that I had a little bit of wiggle room where I would put the pieces of wood that I showed earlier on in the video, but I also wanted to just ensure that the rabbets that I had cut would actually fit the tile mosaic. So after getting the strap clamp attached, I'll be grabbing the tile mosaic and putting it into place to see how well it fits. This tile mosaic was not exactly light, and I didn't want to break it, and so I made sure to handle it with care, and I didn't want to push it too hard to make it fit, but I wanted to find out if I needed to extend the rabbets on any of the pieces, and I made the decision to go ahead and do that exact thing. So I grabbed the tile mosaic that is kind of heavy, like I said, and I pulled off the strap clamp and grabbed the left piece of the frame to do the routering again. And hey, the good thing is this is another opportunity for you to see how this process works before we wrap up this part of the series on how to make a giant oak wood frame for a tile mosaic custom. If you haven't already, you should hit the subscribe button below and the little bell icon next to it so that you stay notified when I release new videos. Support the channel by doing that. And also, if you're curious about other projects, go over to my Instagram, my TikTok, or Facebook, or my website. Make sure to check out the other video that started off this series on how to make this frame, and when I release the future videos for how to make this frame, make sure to check those out too. And also, if you're curious how I milled this wood up, you should go check out the videos on how I milled it. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks, and I'll see you next time. Have fun. Build something cool. Bye. See ya.